Hello and welcome to the unit Scrum of the course Software Engineering Essentials. My name is Stephan, and in this unit you will understand the difference between defined and empirical process control, and we will explain the concepts of Scrum. In the last video we already talked about defined processes such as the waterfall model, the V model or the spiral model. Defined processes are planned and like in production lines where people wait for a certain work activity, then they finish it, and then the next one can proceed. So developers follow strict rules and avoid deviations, which are seen as problems that need to be resolved so that the production line works again. In contrast, there are empirical processes that are not entirely planned. So you have a rough plan and you know the goals where you want to head to, but you do not plan every little activity. Instead, you inspect the activities by doing retrospectives or reviews, and then you adapt the activities like you see in the picture. If you have a strong wave, you might all go to the right side of the boat and save the boat from falling apart. One example of empirical process control is Scrum, which is actually the most popular agile method, and we see a little overview on this slide. In Scrum we start with the product backlog where we have rough requirements, we put them into sprint backlogs and work on them for 2 to 4 weeks. We have a daily Scrum meeting every 24 hours, and at the end of each sprint we have a potentially shippable product increment. Scrum is a management and control process that focuses on early risk management, because in each sprint review at the end of a sprint we look what we have achieved and what we want to do in the next 2 to 4 weeks. The developers deliver working software incrementally, so after each sprint we add functionality to the software, and empirically, which means we adapt the process when it is required. It's a simple framework for effective team collaboration.
Most projects start with a product owner and a list of rough requirements. These requirements are presented to the team on the project kickoff meeting. On that day, each of the rough requirements is inserted into the product backlog, which contains everything that should ideally get implemented. At the beginning of each sprint, the team meets for the sprint planning meeting, where the items from the product backlog get broken down into detailed tasks. Some of these tasks get assigned to the sprint backlog, while others remain in the product backlog for future sprints. During the sprint, the developers will implement tasks in the sprint backlog and present it to the product owner in the sprint review meeting. The team then also has a separate sprint retrospective, where feedback is presented on how the team collaborated together. Summing up, you have a product backlog with rough requirements, which gets specified into the sprint backlog, implemented in 2 to 4 week cycles, and finally get integrated into the potentially shippable product increment.
A Scrum sprint is a time-boxed activity during which the team creates a potentially shippable product increment. Sprints have consistent durations throughout a project. They start with a sprint planning meeting and end with a sprint review meeting. And then a new sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the previous sprint. So we ship the product increment, and then we start with the next sprint planning meeting. We again do the sprint, have a sprint review meeting, ship a product increment, and so on. And what you can already see in this slide is that it's very likely that you put the sprint 1 review and the sprint 2 planning meeting, for example, together so that you combine the team members in a larger meeting to save time. A Scrum team consists of 3 different roles. We have developers who are organized in the development team. A development team is self-organizing, which means they pull the tasks, they estimate the tasks, and they decide what they are working on. And the development team is also cross-functional, which means we have different experts, an analyst, a developer, a tester, a release manager, everything what is required for the project success. And the developers work on the product increment. So they realize the sprint backlog items and turn them into a potentially shippable product increment. The second role is the Scrum Master, who is a moderator who resolves impediments and is responsible that the development team follows the Scrum framework. He's asking questions whether the team goes into the right direction, but he's not a traditional project manager who decides everything, who estimates, and who forces the team to work on certain tasks. And finally, we have the product owner, who is the liaison to the outside world, to all other stakeholders that are interested, and who gathers all the information to define the product, to define the importance of certain requirements by prioritizing them, and who is responsible for the results of the project. You could also think of him as a requirements engineer because he has to get all the information for the requirements. In Scrum we have different meetings, and we want to quickly show you these meetings on the Scrum overview. We have the project kickoff meeting, where we create and prioritize the product backlog together. We have the sprint planning meeting, where we create the sprint backlog in order to start the sprint. So we refine the requirements from the product backlog, we add more details to them, and we select the 2 or 3 or 4 most important backlog items, negotiate with the product owner about how many of them we select, and we put them into the sprint backlog. During the sprint we have daily Scrum meetings every day, which are 15-minute stand-up meetings where we share status, discuss impediments, and promise tasks that we will resolve until the next meeting. In the sprint review meeting, the developers demonstrate the realized backlog items to the product owner, who provides feedback and who decides whether the backlog items are realized, finished, or not. And we also identify changes, we identify new requirements that we then put into the product backlog. And sometimes we also have a sprint retrospective after the sprint review meeting, which is actually recommended. We inspect the sprint and find improvements for the next sprint. Scrum also has artifacts, for example, the product backlog, which is a list of requirements for the whole product, but these requirements are not defined in detail. They are kept vague to keep the effort for the requirements elicitation low, because we don't want to end up with analysis paralysis. We have the sprint backlog, a list of requirements and tasks for one iteration, for one sprint, that is so detailed enough that the developers have all the information to realize and implement the requirements. And we have the potentially shippable product increment at the end of a sprint that is released to the product owner, and it is potentially also released to the end users of the software. And that is the basis for the feedback for the upcoming sprints. In this unit, you learned the differences between defined and empirical process control, and you also learned a modern software lifecycle model, namely Scrum, and its concepts, meetings, and artifacts. See you in the next unit.